This is Danny Haifong, and you are tuning into The Left Lens. So let's get into some lessons from the COVID 19 pandemic. And I think that this will be a subject I will be discussing from now on this program for as long as we are facing this unprecedented crisis. And so I believe that there are certain principles that all socialists should possess. That anyone who claims to be a revolutionary, who claims to be involved in class struggle, who claims to be a member of the working class and oppressed, who claims themselves to be a comrade and a friend to all peoples fighting for a new socialist world, they must have certain principles. So, the first principle I am going to talk about on this program is self determination. And what do I mean by self determination? Well, self determination is the ability for a people, a class, to determine their own destinies, free from the aggression and the diktats of a foreign colonial and imperial power. Now, self determination is a largely alien concept for many who claim to be on the left in the United States and the Western world. That's because the US and the West are a construction of imperialism, and at their foundations is a form of white supremacy which is so deeply embedded in the institutions and the organizational structure of these societies that many on the left are incapable of seeing the importance of self determination. But luckily, we have many socialists, revolutionaries, and movements over the course of the last century plus, which have really paved the way for our understanding of what self determination is and why we must respect it. Any self respecting socialist, any revolutionary who claims to oppose imperialism and capitalism must respect the right of oppressed nations to self determination. Now, many understand this concept as an invention of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Indeed, Lenin was critical in surmising and creating the theory of self determination, which now, up until this day, the United Nations uses in its own Geneva Conventions. But let me just read to you really quick a quote on self determination from Vladimir Lenin. So in 1916, he talked about three types of countries in relation to self determination. And he talked about the imperialist core, those countries in the United States, the countries of the United States, as well as the Western world, which have long ago become empires and have become the oppressing nations, the oppressor nations, those that hold oppressed nations in subservience and under the indirect or direct rule of colonialism. So he talks about colonial countries in a very specific way, those countries which have been completely dependent upon the exploitative, invasive, and destructive tentacles of the colonial imperial powers. He says that socialists must not only demand the unconditional and immediate liberation of the colonies without compensation, then this demand in its political expression signifies nothing more nor less than the recognition of the right to self determination, but must also render determined support to the more revolutionary elements of the bourgeois democratic movements for national liberation in these countries, and assist their rebellion, and if need be, their revolutionary war against the imperialist powers that oppress them. So basically, self determination and respect for it is much more than just saying that nations have the right to self determination. It's also understanding the balance of forces in these countries and making alliances with people's governments, with independent governments, and with national liberation movements and anti imperialist movements abroad in order to weaken the imperialist core. And that, I think, is a huge lesson that we need to learn. The COVID 19 pandemic has shown that the United States as an empire does not care how many people die, how many white Americans die, but especially black Americans and working class people generally die of the COVID 19 pandemic. Empire, imperialism, the rule of finance capital, and the devastation and destruction of the very social base of the working class generally is on the order of the day and always will be, regardless of the crises that come our way. In fact, the COVID 19 pandemic has only accelerated the transfer of wealth to the tiny few imperialist countries as well as the imperialist ruling class elite in order to maintain the hegemony of the US and its imperial allies. We can take a look at the tighter sanctions that have been placed on Iran, the hostilities that China has faced as it has successfully beat back the pandemic and has been providing solidarity all over the world, yet 2/3 of Americans have a negative view of China. And China is under the military duress of the United States as great power competition and the so-called Asia pivot determine the aggressiveness of the US military and completely undermine any basis of peace around the world. In fact, brings us closer to a possible major confrontation between China and the United States. We can also look at how the DPRK, in this time of duress and distress, has been targeted once again as a basket case with the so-called lies of the United States intelligence apparatus saying that Kim Jong-un was in fact dead. And of course, it was a complete lie, but the sanctions remain on the DPRK, and the tens of thousands of troops and military weaponry and arsenal that sits below the DMZ in South Korea continues to terrorize the entire Korean peninsula and the people of Korea who are waging a valiant struggle to reunify their country. We can look at how Venezuela is on the brink of war with the United States, that the United States attempted to install a private mercenary corporation into power through their puppet Juan Guaido just last week, that dozens of mercenaries have been arrested by the people's government in Venezuela, and that Nicolas Maduro, after in 2018 facing an assassination attempt, after 2019 facing a artificial coup attempt led by Juan Guaido and the Trump administration, and now is facing a bounty on his head, as well as many official members of the Bolivarian government, which was levied by the Department of Justice and the Trump administration. $15 million award for those who capture Nicolas Maduro dead or alive. This is the environment that the U.S. empire and the imperialist system has created, and it's all to enrich those like Bezos, Buffett, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, the Trump family, all of these forces, the Koch family, all of these forces, the owners of capital, ultimately have every interest in maintaining hegemony through military means. We have to look at the reality here that the self-determination of oppressed nations is probably the most important lesson that we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic, that there just is no more time for racial jingoism, for racist, white supremacist, and imperialist mentalities among the Western and U.S. left, that this has to be ultimately dropped. And we need to begin to figure out how we can build real alliances with peoples around the world. But the right to self-determination of oppressed nations doesn't only involve the need to respect the sovereignty of other countries and of peoples who are facing the murderous regime change imperialist state. No, it applies right here in the United States, where you have native nations, indigenous nations, being devastated by the COVID-19 pandemic because they do not have the self-determination necessary to ensure that their basic needs are met. We know that the right to self-determination was really spearheaded in many ways by the Black Liberation Movement, that the Black Liberation Movement's upholding of this principle throughout the 20th century has chartered a way forward for Black people to understand themselves as a nation that has been oppressed, that has been robbed from the African continent, first as a slave class and now as a super exploited class here, right here in the United States mainland, where the afterlives of slavery continue to terrorize the people. We know that the mass incarceration regime, the racist policing, the daily murders of black people by the state. We know that the economic condition of black people is always 2 times worse than the working class in general, especially white Americans. We know all of these things to be evidence of why self-determination is so important for black people in the United States and for all colonized and formerly colonized peoples here in the US mainland, the Western world, and the rest of the world. So the right to self-determination of oppressed nations basically involves the idea that independence, sovereignty, and the ability to control one's destiny as a people, as an oppressed people, really must become the principle that guides the way of a socialist movement. Because what we have had in the United States and the West is an economistic worldview, the idea that universal policies and reforms can ultimately be engineered in an imperialist context, when in fact what has to happen is that oppressed peoples need to be in the lead of these movements, need to be the center of focus if the entire working class is going to be liberated from the scourge of capitalism and imperialism. This has been a missing element of our movements, and it's because, one, the state has focused primarily, the imperialist state has focused primarily on destroying movements for self-determination. We see not only the Black liberation movement and the indigenous liberation movements here in the United States be the sole focus of the most repressive mechanisms of the state in destroying these movements, but we also see abroad that any nation that the United States sees as having sovereignty, as having any modicum of independence from finance and multinational capital based in the US and West, that these countries are the targets, the principal targets of all military operations, of all economic forms of warfare. We see that in China. We see that in Vietnam. We see that in the DPRK. We see that in Venezuela. We see that with Cuba. We see that with the Ukraine in 2014, as we saw it in Ukraine in 2014. We saw in Libya in 2011. We see it in Zimbabwe as it continues to be ravaged by sanctions. That wherever we look, where there's an independent nation, there is U.S. imperialism seeking to turn that nation into a subservient client, a client state that will serve its interests and that will ensure that finance capital, multinational capital, foreign capital is kept happy, that its profit margins are boosted, that its products are dumped, that prices are controlled in a way where the US and the West has an advantage, where loans from the World Bank and the IMF continue to privilege the privatization of all resources, and where ultimately people in these countries are left without a national government that serves them. And this is the basic lesson of self-determination of oppressed nations that I wanted to talk about today. I believe that during this pandemic, we need to sharpen our skills, our theoretical skills, our analytical skills, as we look toward the future of the class struggle here in the United States and around the world. As the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed so many contradictions and outright antagonisms of the system, it's important to go over some of these key principles that will ultimately determine which way our movement goes, toward victory and solidarity with the people of the world, or toward major losses and the descent into the completely decrepit system of imperialism that exists here in the United States and the Western world. You've been tuning in to The Left Lens with Danny Haiphong. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you again very soon.